This is going to be the first of these new co-innovation sessions. And my friend Dale Ketchum is going to come lead this with Rob Antypas and Dr. Francisco Pallares. Okay, so the idea with these is the session, we'll have panelists, they'll set the stage, but the session is going to be more, what I say, about a third presentation and 2/3 discussion. And so you'll see there's going to be a survey that you all should go to and answer some of the questions because we're going to pull up some of that discussion real time. And then later when we do the discussion, you all can come up here. I know you got to come up here so the audience sees you, all the audience, and we can have discussion. So we're going to try this out. We're trailblazing here. So with that, I forgot. So Dale Ketchum is leading this, and he's Space Florida's Vice President, Government and External Relations and he is a recognized leader in exploration, national security, and commercial space marketplace through innovation, collaboration, and influence. He's joined by Dr. Rob Antypas, who is the Space Access, Logistics, and Mobility Mission Lead for AFRL. And then Dr. Francisco Pallares, who is the Director of Business Development for the New Mexico Spaceport Authority. So have at it, folks. And good luck.
Yeah, we're very much improvising this panel, and I guess what I would like, I'm sort of going to try to build on going off of what we've done over the last 2 years at the commercial space workshops that were a branch of the breakout sessions from this conference that we held at Cape Canaveral over the last 2 years. And what I want to do is try to help build on what comes out of here and use that to enrich what we're going to be doing at the workshop this year, scheduled for September again at the Cape. But I'm hoping that there'll be a lot of participation. So if any one of us is talking about something that's meaningful and you've got a really powerful question and a burning interest, don't wait. As far as I'm concerned, stick your hand up and let's go ahead and get that dialogue going real quick. I think what I'd like to do is I'll go ahead and touch on a couple of points that I think are meaningful and helpful that I'm hopeful will resonate with you all, and then we'll go to you two and we'll just build off that and hopefully build some degree of momentum. I think what I'd like to start off on is from the perspective of Space Florida, which is obviously what I'm bringing to the table here, is sort of riff off of Dr. Howard's comments earlier about what I found most impactful. Not that Diane isn't always eloquent and pithy and insightful, but she touched on the fact that one of the things we need to be doing with small businesses is helping them as the government does what it does to try to help grow small businesses in the space industrial base, is help them and become aware of the imperative of developing your market apart from the government. Because at Space Florida, we believe very strongly that the market is ultimately what decides success or failure. And the government is a part of that market, but it's not the dominant source. And ultimately, you've got to be able to generate profits and revenue, and that comes from a variety of sources. You got to have the workforce, you got to have the academic institutions, but the market is what drives it. And part of that market, and one of the things that I think Space Florida has been successful at, and the state of Florida has been successful at, is utilizing the capacities of the state. Because you've got the federal government in our competition with China, which was just so eloquently stated just now. That's going to need a whole of government approach to competing with our colleagues on the other side of the Pacific, who are very formidable and challenging, and we're going to need that whole of government approach. But part of the United States, one of the strengths that we bring to the table, one of the reasons why we are the dominant economy in the world is because of what states can bring. Those 50 laboratories of democracy are a big part of the industrial capability of the United States of America. States can do things that the federal government cannot. And Florida's been applying that at the Cape and across the state more broadly. And I think if you look at where the state was 12 years ago with the retirement of the space shuttle and look at where the Cape is now in terms of industrial capability to support the space program, the results of applying our toolkit speak for themselves. So I think being able to utilize what the states bring to the table and incorporating that more intentionally into our development is an important part of the nation's overall efforts. Additionally, I think we're due to, I know Scott McLaughlin, some of our other spaceport directors were all at Cape Canaveral Space Force Station last week because they were the National Spaceport Interagency Working Group is due to publish its document that it will be a national strategy for spaceports. And we were meeting last week to figure out what are the best ways for the implementation of that, because spaceports are a key part, obviously, of what the U.S. brings to the table to enable that launch and recovery and reuse capability, and also a fundamental part of the U.S. resilience. Right now, we have two main launch complexes for federal missions, the Cape and Vandenberg. That doesn't really lend itself to resilience, but it also costs a hell of a lot of money to build launch infrastructure. So you've got dynamics as to what's the best way to make something work. I'm not going to tell you we know the answer, but we're working on that. But that again is a whole of government, whole of the United States approach to it. I think I'll shut up for a minute and let these other guys talk a little bit.
Get started. Sorry, I have to clear my voice before I start talking. And adding to what Dale was just mentioning, to the whole ecosystem, not just from the perspective of the states. I'm relatively new to the aerospace industry. I'm an economist by training. And one of the key aspects of what I found out once I started digging into the aerospace economy was one of the aspects that Diane Howard was actually mentioning, right? The public sector in the aerospace industry is a very major player for a lot of it, right? You can see, yes, that there's the private commercial that is dedicated or aimed towards the customers or the consumers, the end users, but without the public sector, it is a massive vacuum that would be left in there in the aerospace industry, right? That was just adding a little bit to that, but also in the efforts that to me, it was a surprise in the efforts that a little bit of the discrepancies or the differences that exist from the federal government to the efforts that states are doing, right? And they'll refer to Florida as being one of those states that has committed substantial amounts of money. The state of New Mexico has committed substantial amounts of money also in the development of the aerospace industry, correct? I mean, the spaceport in itself is completely a state entity. It's a state venture. It is one of those key aspects that we keep reminding ourselves that we're public employees and that we are aiming in the assistance of a cluster, right? An economic development type of base that brings jobs in the aerospace sector. And that was the main intention for which the spaceport was created. But then again, we find ourselves in this discussion or in this difficulty. And one of the things that I wanted to, well, specifically the point that I was trying to make is that to me, it was amazing coming from different sectors, how in the aerospace field, there's only those two basically orbital launching capabilities that we have as a nation. To me, that seems amazing because they are vulnerable, right? And there's this discussion that Space Force continues to have about the resiliency and being able to launch. But if you only have a couple of places from which you can launch, and those places have high amounts of traffic, precisely because the demand has been increasing, well, it makes it quite difficult, right? And Spaceport America has been able to do a lot of things that many spaceports haven't been able to do, but still we're not at the level at which Cape Canaveral at which Vandenberg are capable of going, right? Which is going orbital. And that's part of the discussion of what we have, and we realize that ourselves. And that is actually the area in which we're trying to spearhead. Actually, Scott is right here in the room, but Scott is my boss. But one of the key aspects, for instance, that we have been working on, well, that he has been working on, has been pushing on doing a price, right? Something similar to the X price, in which we can have the state of New Mexico commit a chunk of money to supporting or a vehicle that can go orbital out of an inland spaceport, right? And he's been pushing that through the legislature, and he's been pushing it through several other channels. And one of the ideas is we need to have diversification, right? I mean, think of your 401ks, right? Your 401ks go in a diversified type of base precisely because you need diversification. You don't put all of your eggs in one basket. And if we're putting all of our eggs in two major spaceports, then it makes it very difficult. It's actually a risky type of thing. With that, I'll remain silent and move to Robert.
Oh, I realized I screwed up and we both screwed up. There are a number of ways to get to orbit from the United States. The Cape and Vandenberg are two big ones, but I know I'll hear it from General Mercer if I don't mention that Wallops in Virginia is also quite capable, and they do launch cargo to the International Space Station. But then again, that still doesn't completely address the resiliency that the nation needs going forward.
Let's try that. All right, awesome. So yeah, I was going to mention Wallops in Virginia and then also Kodiak, Alaska. So we have two main launch ports, as you previously discussed, which have come from decades of capital, U.S. government investment and state investment decades ago. Those are capital national assets that we spent literally billions, and it might cost much more than that to recreate. We're working towards building up, as you mentioned, Virginia. There's Kodiak. We're leveraging New Zealand. But what is going to drive, as you mentioned, an influx in variability or more launch sites and inland launch sites? What brings that to the forefront? What enables our policy providers to be able to say, yes, this looks like something that we can get our heads behind and we can get behind, and that's reliability, right? We see images from the inland Chinese launch ports landing hypergolics or solid rocket bodies on towns, and that scares populations, that scares policymakers, that scares people. But what we can see and there's one provider now that is doing it, but there are more providers coming online who are investing in reusability and reliability. And with reliability and reusability comes an order of magnitude. With reusability comes an order of magnitude greater reliability. And so can we get those policy perspectives to get in line with the new reliability of what we're seeing? We're taking something that was, 1 in a million chance down to something that's 1 in 10 million, 1 in a billion chance of something happening if we keep our corridors correct and this moving forward. I think there is the possibility to move inland with reliability and reusability. With that, our competitors don't care about that. I don't think that they're demonstrating that they don't. They're barge launching, as we heard before. They already have mobile launch capability. They already have barge launch capability. They are building out a tactical infrastructure for tactical responsive space launch and space access. And if we are only leveraging our two capital investment launch facilities and maybe two others that are burgeoning, we leave ourselves in a position of disadvantage. So I'd like to leave with that.
One topic I think that would be meaningful probably to a lot of people in here, because everybody in here doesn't care about launch. Ultimately, you want to get your payload into space, but that's not your focus. But one of the interesting developments that I bring to your attention that I found particularly intriguing as a reflection of the growth and expansion of the overall human enterprise in space is the number of regulatory agencies that are getting involved in our industry. And, you know, when I've been in this business a very long time, but I know it was always basically NASA, Air Force, and the Department of Transportation, the FAA. They were the big three. But now, you know, Department of Commerce is a major player in large measure because of the previous Secretary of Commerce just really thought it was cool as heck. But Commerce is very involved. They're increasingly, and they have a critical role to play in regulatory affairs of the space agency, space enterprise writ large. FCC is increasingly a big player simply for that makes sense because people have to communicate. Bandwidth is a big problem in this industry as it is elsewhere. But last at the symposium, I was sitting next to a colleague of mine from Florida who was talking about how they had just 2 months ago printed up on the International Space Station living cardiovascular tissue with the goal of creating patches for hearts that are damaged in a heart attack. And I'm looking at him going, living cardiovascular tissue is being printed up on the International Space Station. And what that means is we're soon going to have the FDA as a regulatory authority in space. And if you thought the FAA was slow, wait till you have to deal with the FDA. But additionally, another topic that's of increasing interest to us, and it was mentioned earlier, is space-based nuclear propulsion and power systems. One of the challenges we have at the Cape is it almost triggers a NEPA action if you remove a commercially developed, which is where we're going, like most everything else. Much of the next nuclear, either propulsion or power systems, is going to be commercial. And if you move a nuclear material, commercial nuclear material from a payload processing facility at KSC across the border to launch at Cape Canaveral Air Force Station, it's almost a NEPA exercise. And so the NRC, Nuclear Regulatory Commission, is going to increasingly become part of the regulatory structure of the broader space enterprise. Now, you can look at that as a good thing because that's a recognition and a reflection of the growth of what space means to everything we do in life. But it's also kind of a red flag that if we are going to compete with the Chinese and the Indians and everybody else, the Europeans and the Brazilians and Japanese and everybody else who's in the marketplace, we're going to need to clean up our act as a being able to have these regulatory commissions and agencies work in overlapping capacities because, you know, I'm old enough and cynical enough to know that's a disaster waiting to happen. Fortunately, I think everybody knows that, but it still is going to be incumbent upon all of us to put pressure on those federal agencies and Congress and the White House to make sure we're executing as wisely as possible.
I think I'd like to add one thing to that. It's also a huge barrier to entry for all of our new space companies. So if you don't have the regulatory backing or the infrastructure to be able to navigate that, it is a huge logistical nightmare for people who are coming into this field and trying to navigate that launch space. And we can see it from inception to the first launch, which statistically usually fails, and then the recovery of that. It's mostly the timelines are mostly driven by the regulatory process and not the technical process of finding out what happened and how to recover from that. So the barrier to entry for our new space tech companies, not just as a nation and strategically, there's a tactical benefit or drawback as well.
I'd just like to add that, I mean, you're absolutely right on that, Dale, that the aerospace industry right now is being a victim of its own success, right? And the fact that it has more and more industries besides the aerospace industry are finding ways to do and finding new things that they can do with the aerospace industry, which is a good thing by all means, exactly. But that's why I was saying that you're absolutely right. But what it will mean is that also our dependency, right, on other aspects that are to our day-to-day lives, if there's new medicines or if there's new manufacturing processes, if there's this new tissue that is going to be generated, and newer things are going to start being developed at the space, that resiliency that we keep discussing about it's going to mean more for us, right? I mean, what do you like? 20 years ago, a cell phone in our pockets wasn't that much, right? Right now, every single person in this room has a cell phone that they cannot move away from, correct? So the dependency on something that increases our ease of living, the capacity that we currently have, it's actually good for us, right? Because we're in the aerospace industry, but it is also going to mean more of that involvement of other agencies that need to be part of it.
And they need to be part of it though, because as we get in an increasingly crowded environment, they have to keep the space open and free use of access to everybody who wants to come in. But we have to make those barriers to entry as low as possible so we can still continue the innovations, the innovative spirit that got us to where we are here today.
Any questions? We've still got, yes. Oh,
Yeah.
I need glasses.
Yeah, so I think there's a comment on Starlink, if we want to discuss what that's bringing to the table. There's a comment on a viable business case. What is a viable business case? Materials and cost, and then quick transport to the moon and back to increase ROI for resource exploitation.
Well, I guess on the, I'll touch on viable business case. I think one thing I've noticed over the years is a viable business case in space is absolutely no different than a viable business case anywhere. You've got to be, there's nothing unique about being in space. Your business has to generate revenue, have cash flow, and hopefully make a profit. And to assume there's something unique about your business case because you're in space is naive and dangerous, because your investors are going to want their money back, and they're going to want to see equity improve. They're going to want their debts repaid on time and with interest. There's no distinction. If you're in the space business, you're in business. Don't assume anything different just because you've got space somewhere in your title.
Well, and I think increasingly more and more so, the government is not the biggest user of the space environment anymore as well. So while for the past 4 decades, we've been the biggest proponent and the biggest cost driver of space, it's changing. The paradigm is changing. So that business case has to be a commercial business case and not a government sponsored or government funded, wholly government funded business case.
Which enables me to bring up another point that my boss will shoot me if I don't. Building on that point that business is business, one of the things that we've been working on for quite a few years that is now coming to fruition in that it's been introduced into both the House and the Senate is tax-free spaceport bonds. Because right now the country grants a tax-free status for bonds based on, for airport and seaport bonds. Well, for the reasons they granted a tax-free status, it makes sense that that should apply also to spaceports. And the reason that's important is because that is bringing additional capabilities to access the private capital markets for the space enterprise. And private capital markets have a hell of a lot more money than the federal government ever will. That's where the money is. That's what's going to drive our competitiveness. It's not relying on the Department of Defense or NASA or anybody else. You've got to get out there and get in the marketplace and compete in the private capital markets. And this tax exempt capability will help significantly improve capital coming into our industry, the overall space enterprise. But there is a distinct difference because the private capital markets, unlike the federal government, they want their money back and they want it back on time with interest. And that's a hard transition to make, but that is an absolutely essential transition to make because then when we do, we are off and running.
I have 20/20 vision, but I can't read what's on the screen. Those are tiny.
Let me go with, let me throw one other thing out there from that's sort of ripping off of what we covered at last year's commercial launch breakout session. We had addressed Colonel Shoemaker, who's now CO at Vandenberg, led a panel that addressed how would the Cape or any other launch site continue to meet the needs of the warfighter by being able to put payloads in space if a number of our pads were smoldering ruins, complements of Chinese hypersonics, or for that matter, were dead weight because of Russian cyber attacks or a Cat 5 hurricane. We needed to be able to effectively address how you continue to fight a war if all of a sudden you find yourself in a war. How do you prevail when all of a sudden you've got significant obstacles, whether they're imposed by an adversary or a result of human error or act of nature? And one of the things we're building on for this upcoming one is how do we position the space-based industrial capacity, the space supply chain, or more broadly, just the industrial or industrial capability of the United States. How are we conditioning those suppliers to continue to serve a war effort if the United States of America is actually part of the contested territory? If our communities and our factories and our power supply are being hit, what if all of a sudden we're like what Ukraine is now? How, because we can't sit there and stare at the TV screen like we did at 9/11 and go, holy crap, what do we do now? If we are beginning to prepare now, not just for the industry, but for the communities in the world, the communities in which these industries exist, how are we preparing them to deal with what previous generations going back to World War II have not had to deal with? How are we going to respond? Because if we're getting punched in the teeth, how do we turn that quickly into anger and vengeance and so we can start punching somebody else in the teeth? And I think that's part of what we're going to be exploring at our event in September. Oh, we can read now. Yes. You want to go ahead?
Well, I think I want to touch on that though. So I don't actually want to touch on the loss of capability, but I do want to say that our adversaries, from what we saw previously in the last briefing, they're preparing for a scenario where they need diversified launch. So they have those capabilities now, and we're relying on really truly a singular provider at 2 launch facilities to do the bulk mass of our orbit transfer. With that though, if we take from the previous briefing, if we take the Starlink missions, it was prompted before, but if we on the screen, if we take the Starlink missions out of the equation, the US is not launching more than what our adversaries are, or at least one of our adversaries. And so the question then says, are we skewing our own data by claiming national pride in the most launches and the most reusable launches and all of that? It gets scary when you remove the dedicated Starlink missions from our statistics. So it's something to think about. We've been said, I've heard multiple times that in peacetime and currently right now, we can launch anything we want, anywhere we want, anytime we want. But that's scheduled, and that's scheduled months in advance, sometimes 60, 90 days. Is that tactically relevant for what we need in the future? And I just wanted to say that before we get to some of these questions.
I just add a little bit to that. So keeping that perspective, right, of the infrastructure and some of the potential needs that we can have of having those inland launches as well. One key aspect of it, and actually it's, I think, the last question right there, kind of like in the future, going towards the future. We keep thinking about for defense purposes, right? Which makes absolute sense, right? We need to have this for our defense purposes, but what is that going to be reflective on towards the future for the average citizen in the US, right? Can we imagine then a world, right? Or can we imagine then a communication, or can we imagine a travel point to point that is super fast? Can we start discussing about going from Oklahoma to Spaceport America in 20 minutes, right? It's so, I think that, I mean, even our infrastructure, right? The interstates in itself started as a defense project at some point, and now we all enjoy the benefits of this. It is crucial that we think of this from the defense standpoint, but also the potential effects that it can have for the future in terms of the commerce in itself, right? I think that once we do get to that cadence, to that capability, and we have spaceports all across the nation, right? And not just across the nation, but across the world, we can start thinking about point-to-point travel. We can start thinking about rapid delivery, cargo delivery, right? Or other potential things that might be more impactful to the everyday American, right? That is useful for that.
I think we've already seen it, right? In COM and some other places, GPS, the civilian market is much bigger than the DoD market. So if we can find a need, maybe it might be a defense need that starts this process, but the commercial need outweighs the commercial benefit definitely outweighs the defense need. And that's the case, right? If we do stay in this peacetime or this competition time for a prolonged period, that's great. It inspires us to push forward and build our commercial space. That's only good for the nation.
One of the questions that just went away dealt with the capacity constraints on the existing launch sites. Because I know obviously at the Cape, we're launching a lot. We'll get to 100 launches this year, but we're also planning on 200, 300, 400 launches in the years to come. But obviously there is a limit to how many launches you can have at one location. And that's apart from, you know, how wise is it to have all those launches at one location. But I think the problem that we're having at the Cape is not launch sites, because Space Force is still opening up new launch sites at the Cape. And NASA's looking at a couple new ones. The constraint is not launch sites, it's liquefied natural gas, it's commodities, it's things like that. We don't have the infrastructure in place yet to support 300 launches a year. That's our challenge. But we're also able to leverage that demand with the commercial sector to work with the natural gas suppliers to bring in that capability. We're not, you know, NASA and Space Force, they're not going to spend their resources on putting in a liquefied natural gas capability because they can meet their existing needs. So should DoD be spending money on that when the commercial sector can pay for it? Not if the commercial sector can pay for it. But oldie IM moon landing. Odysseus. That was awesome, and will be again. I think, again, Diane mentioned the CLIPS program as a reflection of the commercial sector, the government effectively turning to the commercial sector to meet its mission needs, whether it's exploration or national security. That is going to be successful. Everyone knew the whole purpose of CLIPS was that there would be failures. And the first one was a success, but not the success they wanted, but they'll learn from it. And there's more in the pipeline. There'll be more and more and more coming from different concepts, different locations. And that, again, is a reflection of the marketplace responding to a government, a wise government decision to open it up, to commit to a certain level of demand, to say, we'll be a part of your customer base. But again, getting to the point that Diane made, will be a part of your customer base, but you've got to put together a business case and raise money from the private capital markets to invest in so that there are other customers as well. Because most investors are not going to invest in this stuff if the government is your only customer. Yes, sir.
Isn't that a great model to use also to build a spaceport infrastructure that recognizes some sort of
Oh, absolutely. And I think that's what, like at Space Florida, we can access most of what we invest in is private sector capital, but there is some state Department of Transportation funds invested in there. And if it's going to be a road or a comms or development for common use by a number of companies, then the state will pay for that because it's in our interest to make that investment. But if it's for one company, then the state will reimburse that. That company has to pay for that infrastructure, but the state will reimburse them 50% up to a fixed amount based upon how many jobs and capital investment and all that usual formulaic stuff. But that being able to play to the marketplace is the best way to go forward.
I think to go further on that, how did we build our airports? The states, with federal help, largely paid for those. And because of the economic benefit that brought to each state, each city, there's a model for that for spaceports, I think.
I'm
Is that
bringing
the
these
signal?
little chimes. Well, I think, I forgot to tell you all. So on our working groups, we hold to Chatham House rules. And that means, you can talk about what's being said, but you can't attribute it. And we're on these co-innovation sessions, we're going to be doing that as well. However, we will be recording it so that we can have the notes. This will be the first time we'll pull these into the annual report. But your questions, even if they didn't cover them, it's in the recording and we'll be able to sort of write that up and maybe even get the team here to answer through the report if we didn't address it. But thank you for being the first ever leaders of the co-innovation session. And thank you. And I have any inputs on this? I mean, we want to have all the participants be able to have a say in these topic areas. I think we could definitely give them a little more time, but that'll have to be for next year's agenda. I did mean to, after Dr. Goswami's presentation, I wanted to give a shout out to my friends at the Spaceport. I am all about New Mexico and our Spaceport America. I love the group there, but I loved how China is using the tourism, and I think we should do more of that with our spaceport and with Virgin Galactic leading in space tourism. We also are doing some things that you're going to hear about tomorrow with our Pathways to the Stars, our workforce program. And I haven't actually told any of my team, but we're trying to bring back the National Space Day. And actually next year it's the first Friday in May. So maybe we'll schedule our State of the Space Industrial Base Conference around that. So that will help with the, getting our space industry supported throughout our whole public. So with that, we're going to break for lunch.